Jake Martinez stepped off the transport ship and looked up at the massive crystal towers that reached into the purple sky, the Nexus Military Institute on Kepler. 7 was nothing like the military academies back on Earth. Everything here was huge and strange. The buildings looked like they were grown rather than built, with smooth curves and surfaces that seemed to glow from within. He adjusted his uniform and picked up his single bag. 3 years of paperwork and testing had led to this moment. He was one of only 3 humans ever accepted into the galaxy's most famous war college. The other 2 humans had graduated decades ago and were now high-ranking officers in the Galactic Defense Council. Jake hoped he could live up to their example. The main entrance was crowded with beings from dozens of different worlds. Jake saw tall, thin creatures with blue skin walking next to short, furry beings that looked like walking teddy bears. Some had wings, others had extra arms, and a few floated instead of walking. The diversity was amazing, but also intimidating. A holographic sign in the air directed new students to the registration area. Jake followed the floating arrows through corridors that changed color as different species walked through them. He wondered if the building was reading their emotions or just responding to their presence. At the registration desk, a creature with 6 arms and metallic skin looked up at him. Its voice came from a translator device attached to its chest. "Name and species," it said in a flat tone. "Jake Martinez, human from Earth," he replied. The creature's multiple eyes widened slightly. "Human? Interesting. You are assigned to Advanced Combat Theory, Professor Vextar, Level 7. Your room assignment is in your data packet." It handed him a small device that projected information into the air. Jake found his room on Level 3. It was small but comfortable, with a bed that adjusted his human shape, and a window that looked out over the academy grounds. Hundreds of students moved between buildings, some walking, others flying, and a few that seemed to teleport short distances. His roommate was already there when Jake entered. The being was about Jake's height, but covered in green scales with large golden eyes. "I am Kesh from Verdun Prime," the creature said in perfect English. "You must be the human I heard about. My species has studied your people since you joined the galactic community. Very interesting warriors. Humans are." "Thanks, I think," Jake said, setting his bag on the empty bed. "What do you know about Professor Vextar?" Kesh's scales shifted to a darker green. "Vextar is Zenthri, very old, very traditional. He teaches warfare the way his ancestors did for thousands of years. Some say he does not like new ideas or new species in his classes." Jake nodded. He had expected some resistance. Humans were the newcomers in galactic politics, having only made contact with other species 50 years ago. Many of the older civilizations still saw them as primitives who had barely learned to travel between stars. The next morning, Jake made his way to his first class. Advanced Combat Theory was held in a large amphitheater with seats arranged in a circle around a central area. The room was already half full when he arrived. He chose a seat near the middle and looked around at his classmates. There was a group of tall, pale beings with flowing robes who moved with perfect coordination. Jake recognized them as ethereals, a species known for their precise military formations. Near them sat several heavily armored creatures that looked like walking tanks. Those had to be Corvins, famous for their siege warfare. On the other side of the room, a group of turtle-like beings discussed something in low, rumbling voices. Jake remembered reading about the garrison species and their legendary defensive strategies. Every species here represented thousands of years of military tradition and experience. Professor Vextar entered the room, and all conversation stopped. The Zenthri was impressive, standing nearly 8 feet tall with 6 arms that moved independently. His skin was a deep purple color, and his eyes were solid black. When he spoke, his voice filled the room without any need for amplification. "Welcome to Advanced Combat Theory," Vextar began, his gaze sweeping across the students. "In this class, you will learn the time-tested methods of warfare that have kept peace in this galaxy for millennia. You will study the great campaigns, the classic strategies, and the proven tactics that your species have perfected over countless generations." His eyes stopped on Jake, and the human felt like he was being examined under a microscope. "Some of you come from species with short military histories," Vextar continued. still looking at Jake. You will learn much from those whose ancestors mastered warfare when your worlds were still learning to make fire. Jake felt his face get warm, but he kept his expression neutral. Several of the other students glanced in his direction, and he could sense their curiosity and perhaps some amusement. Today we will begin with an overview of classical warfare principles, Vextar said, moving to the center of the room. A holographic display appeared in the air, showing various battle formations and movement patterns. The foundation of all military science rests on 3 pillars: preparation, precision, and patience. For the next hour, Vextar explained how successful military campaigns required months or years of planning. He showed examples from different species, each following similar patterns of careful preparation, methodical execution, and patient development of advantages over time. The ethereal students nodded approvingly when Vextar discussed their ancestors' perfect fleet maneuvers. The Corvins straightened with pride when he described their systematic approach to breaking enemy defenses. The garrison representatives made approving sounds when their defensive doctrines were praised. Jake listened carefully, taking notes on his data pad. Everything Vextar taught made sense from a traditional military perspective. These methods had worked for thousands of years across dozens of species. But something felt wrong to Jake. All of these approaches assumed that warfare followed predictable patterns, that enemies would behave according to established rules. As the class ended, Vextar made an announcement that caught Jake's attention. Tomorrow we will begin practical exercises. Each of you will have the opportunity to demonstrate your species' approach to warfare. I expect detailed presentations showing how your ancestors would handle various scenarios. Jake gathered his things and left the classroom, his mind already working. How could he explain human warfare to beings who thought in terms of centuries-old traditions? Humans had been fighting wars for thousands of years too, but their approach was fundamentally different. Where these species had perfected rigid systems, humans had perfected the art of adaptation. As he walked back to his room, Jake realized that tomorrow's class might be more interesting than Professor Vextar expected. The next morning, Jake arrived at class early to find the amphitheater had been transformed. The central area now contained a massive holographic projector surrounded by control panels. Professor Vextar stood beside it, checking various displays with 2 of his 6 arms, while the other for arranged data tablets. Students filed in, chattering excitedly about the practical exercise. Jake noticed that many had brought additional materials, digital tablets, and what looked like prepared presentations. He had only a standard data pad and a growing sense that he was about to do something that might get him kicked out of the academy. When everyone was seated, Professor Vextar activated the central projector. A 3-dimensional image appeared in the air, showing a planet with detailed surface features, orbital stations, and defensive installations. Today's scenario, Vextar announced, involves a theoretical invasion of Fortress Prime, a heavily defended world in the neutral zone. Your mission is to plan and execute a successful assault with limited resources and time constraints. The planet rotated slowly in the hologram, revealing massive shield generators, orbital defense platforms, and ground-based weapon systems. Cities were protected by energy barriers, and space around the planet was filled with automated defense satellites. The defending force consists of 50,000 troops with advanced weapons and perfect knowledge of the terrain. Vextar continued. The attacking force has 30,000 troops, standard equipment, and must succeed within 6 months or face reinforcements that will make victory impossible. Jake studied the hologram carefully. The planet was indeed heavily fortified, but he noticed several things that the defensive setup assumed about how an attack would come. All the defenses were designed to stop traditional assault methods. We will begin with the Corvin approach, Vextar said, gesturing to Commander Thexol, a massive armored being who stood nearly 7 feet tall. Commander, please demonstrate your species' methodology. Thexol moved to the control panel with slow, deliberate steps. His thick fingers worked the controls, and the hologram changed to show Corvin ships approaching the planet in perfect formation. The Corvin way is simple and effective, Thexol said in a deep voice that rumbled like distant thunder. We establish orbital supremacy through systematic destruction of defensive platforms. Phase 1 takes 60 days to eliminate all space-based defenses. The hologram showed Corvin warships methodically destroying orbital stations one by one. Each attack was carefully planned and executed with precision. No ship moved out of formation. No attack began before the previous one was complete. Phase 2 involves ground preparation. Thexol continued. We bombard military targets for 30 days, destroying supply lines and command centers. Phase 3 is a landing, where we establish secure beachheads and advance in coordinated waves. Jake watched as the Corvin plan unfolded. It was thorough, methodical, and would probably work. It was also exactly what the defenders would expect. Every move followed standard military doctrine that had been taught in academies across the galaxy for centuries. Total operation time, Thexol concluded, 180 days. Victory probability, 85%. Several students nodded approvingly. Professor Vextar made notes on his tablet. Excellent demonstration of classical siege warfare. Commander, Captain Zarlin, please show us ethereal approach. Captain Zarlin glided to controls with a flowing grace typical of her species. Her pale, luminous skin seemed to glow as she worked the holographic interface with delicate, precise movements. Ethereal warfare focuses on precision and minimal casualties, she said in a voice like musical chimes. We do not waste resources on brute force when surgical strikes can achieve the same results. The hologram changed to show sleek ethereal ships moving in complex patterns around the planet. Instead of direct attacks, they launched small, precise strikes against specific targets. We identify critical nodes of the defensive network, Zarlin explained. By destroying exactly 17 key installations in a specific sequence, we can create cascading failures throughout their entire system. This requires 42 days of careful positioning and timing. Jake had to admit it was elegant. The ethereal plan would work, and with far fewer casualties than the Corvin approach. But it still assumed the defenders would respond in predictable ways. Once defenses are neutralized, we deploy occupation forces to secure population centers. Total operation time, 63 days. Victory probability, 91% with minimal losses. More approving nods from the class. Professor Vextar looked pleased as he made more notes. Excellent precision, Captain. Now, who can show us a defensive perspective? Yes, Sergeant Corval from the garrison. The turtle-like being moved slowly to controls, his heavy shell making soft scraping sounds against the floor. When he spoke, his voice was deep and patient. Garrison doctrine teaches that the best offense comes from perfect defense, Corval said. If we were defending this world, we would make it impossible to take, forcing attackers to exhaust themselves against our preparations. The hologram shifted to show additional defensive structures appearing on the planet's surface. Underground bunkers connected by tunnels, hidden weapon installations, and supply depots buried deep beneath the surface. We would prepare for a siege lasting years if necessary. Every citizen becomes part of the defense. Every building becomes a fortress. Eventually, attackers must give up or face complete destruction of their forces. Jake noticed that several other students looked uncomfortable with this approach. It was effective, but it meant the planet's population would suffer through years of warfare. After Corval finished, several other students presented their species approaches. Each was well planned and based on thousands of years of military experience. Each would probably work given enough time and resources, and each was exactly the kind of attack the planet's defenses were designed to stop. Finally, Professor Vextar looked directly at Jake. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, perhaps you can enlighten us about human combat doctrine. I am curious to see what approach a species with such a brief military history might suggest. The amphitheater fell silent. Jake could feel dozens of alien eyes watching him as he stood up. He walked to the holographic controls, very aware that he was about to either prove himself or embarrass his entire species. Professor, Jake said, looking up at the imposing Zenthri, I'd rather show you than tell you, if that's okay. Vextar's black eyes narrowed slightly. You wish to demonstrate rather than present a formal analysis? Yes, sir. Human warfare isn't really something you can explain with charts and diagrams. It has to be seen to be understood. Several students whispered to each other. Jake heard the word primitive mentioned more than once. Professor Vextar considered the request for a long moment. His four upper arms crossed while his two lower arms continued taking notes. "Very well, Lieutenant Colonel. Show us this human approach to warfare. I confess I am curious to see what your species considers military doctrine." Jake placed his hands on the holographic controls and smiled. "Thank you, Professor. But I should warn you, human combat doctrine isn't like what you've seen before." He began working the controls, and the hologram started to change. Jake's fingers moved across the holographic controls with surprising speed and confidence. The image of Fortress Prime began to change as he added new elements to the display. Unlike the other students who had worked slowly and methodically, Jake seemed to be creating the battlefield scenario in real time. Human warfare, Jake began, still working controls, starts with understanding that no plan survives contact with the enemy. Everything you think you know about how a battle will go is probably wrong. He added weather patterns to the planet, showing seasonal storms and atmospheric disturbances that the original scenario had ignored. Then he marked civilian population centers, trade routes, communication networks, and resource distribution points across the planet's surface. The first thing humans do is gather information, not just military intelligence, but everything. What do people eat? How do they communicate? What makes them angry? What makes them afraid? Jake continued adding details to the hologram. We mapped the human terrain as much as the physical terrain. Several students leaned forward, intrigued by the level of detail Jake was incorporating. Professor Vextar watched with two arms crossed, but Jake noticed that his other four arms had stopped taking notes and were focused entirely on the display. "Most species plan a battle and then execute that plan," Jake said, now adding economic data streams and social network patterns to the hologram. "Humans plan for the plan to fail, then plan for the backup plan to fail, then plan for what happens when we have no plan at all." The holographic display was becoming incredibly complex, but instead of looking chaotic, patterns were starting to emerge. Jake had created what looked like a living model of not just a planet, but an entire civilization. You see, every other approach we've heard today assumes the enemy will respond in predictable ways. Jake continued, his hands never stopping their work on the controls. The Corvins assume defenders will meet them head-on in space. The Ethereals assume defenders will follow standard network protocols. The Garrison assumes attackers will try to break through fixed defenses. He paused his work and looked around the amphitheater. But what if the defenders don't do what you expect? What if they adapt? What if they change their tactics in the middle of the battle? Jake returned to controls and began showing multiple simultaneous approaches to planet. Instead of one coordinated assault, he displayed dozens of smaller operations happening at the same time. "This is how humans approach warfare," he said. "We don't just plan one way to win. We plan 50 ways to win, and we prepare for all of them to happen at once." The hologram now showed human forces approaching the planet from dozens of different angles and using dozens of different methods. Some ships came in traditional attack formations, others disguised as merchant vessels. Some forces landed openly while others infiltrated through smuggling routes. "But Professor," interrupted Commander Thexol, "how do you coordinate such chaos? How do you maintain command and control when everything is happening simultaneously?" Jake smiled. "That's the interesting part. We don't control it. We guide it." He manipulated the controls to show the internal structure of human forces. Instead of rigid hierarchies and predetermined roles, each unit had multiple possible missions and the authority to choose which one pursue based on current conditions. Every human soldier is trained to think independently while working as part of a team, Jake explained. Our sergeants can make decisions that other species reserve for generals. Our privates are taught to adapt their tactics based on what they see in front of them. The display showed how human units were constantly changing their approaches based on enemy responses. When defenders moved to counter one threat, human forces would shift to exploit the weakness that movement created. "You see," Jake continued, "most species perfect their warfare over thousands of years, creating beautiful, efficient systems. But beautiful and efficient systems are also predictable systems. And predictable systems can be beaten." Professor Vextar's mandibles clicked together, a sign of agitation in Zenthari. "But without established doctrine, without proven methods, how do you ensure success?" How do you train for something that has no fixed form? Jake worked the controls again, and the hologram zoomed in to show individual human soldiers in training scenarios. We train for adaptation itself. We practice improvisation. We study every form of warfare we can find, not to copy it, but to understand it well enough to counter it. The training scenarios showed human soldiers practicing with weapons and tactics from dozens of different species. In one simulation, they fought like Corvins with heavy armor and coordinated advances. In another, they moved with ethereal precision and grace. In a third, they used garrison defensive techniques. A human soldier might use Corvin tactics in the morning, ethereal precision in the afternoon, and create something completely new in the evening. Jake said, "We don't perfect one way of fighting. We perfect the ability to fight any way the situation requires." Captain Zara Lynn spoke up, her musical voice carrying a note of confusion. "But surely there must be some underlying principles? Some core doctrine that guides your actions." Jake nodded. "There are principles. 3 of them, actually. First, the enemy gets a vote. Whatever you plan, the enemy will try to stop you, and they might succeed. Second, everything changes. The situation at the end of a battle will be completely different from the situation at the beginning. Third, victory goes to whoever adapts fastest." He zoomed the display back out to show the full planetary scenario. The human assault was now a constantly shifting network of operations, with forces moving and adapting in real time as defenders responded to their actions. "This looks incredibly complex," observed Sergeant Corval. "How long would it take to plan such an operation?" Jake checked his chronometer and grinned. "I've been working on this for about 15 minutes. Most of the detailed planning would happen during the execution, as field commanders adapt to changing conditions." The amphitheater fell silent. Even Professor Vextar had stopped clicking his mandibles. The idea that a major military operation could be planned and adapted in real time was revolutionary to species that thought in terms of months or years of preparation. But the most important thing about human warfare, Jake said, making final adjustments to the hologram, isn't the complexity or the adaptation or the improvisation. It's the acceptance that warfare is fundamentally unpredictable, and the willingness to embrace that unpredictability instead of fighting against it. The holographic display now showed a complete picture of human-style warfare, fluid, adaptive, and alive in a way that made the previous presentations look static by comparison. Jake stepped back from the controls and looked up at Professor Vextar. "Would you like me to show you how this would actually work against the defenses of Fortress Prime?" Professor Vextar stared at the complex holographic display for a long moment. His 6 arms moved restlessly, 2 still holding his data tablets, while the others gestured at the air as if trying to grasp something invisible. "Proceed, Lieutenant Colonel," he said finally. "Show us this human solution." Jake nodded and began manipulating the controls again. The hologram came alive with movement as he initiated the human assault on Fortress Prime. At first, it looked like pure chaos. Dozens of different operations began simultaneously, with no apparent coordination or overall structure. "This appears completely random," Commander Thexol rumbled. "How can you call this a military operation?" "Watch," Jake replied simply and continued working the controls. What had seemed like chaos began to reveal underlying patterns. The random-looking attacks were actually carefully timed diversions, each one designed to pull defensive forces in different directions. As defenders responded to threats in one area, human forces struck in completely different locations. "You see, the defenders of Fortress Prime have prepared for traditional assaults," Jake explained as the simulation continued. "Their orbital platforms are positioned to counter mass fleet attacks. Their ground defenses are designed to stop coordinated invasions, but they've never faced an enemy that attacks from 50 directions at once." In the hologram, human special forces teams were infiltrating the planet through routes that no sane military planner would consider. Some disguised themselves as refugees and entered through humanitarian aid stations. Others hid in cargo shipments that passed through the planet's trade networks. A few even used the planet's waste disposal systems to reach the surface. "This is impossible," Captain Zarlin said, her luminous skin flickering with agitation. "No commander could coordinate so many separate operations." You're right, Jake agreed. No single commander could coordinate all of this. That's why we don't try to. He zoomed in to show the command structure of the human forces. Instead of a single central command giving orders to subordinate units, there were multiple command nodes, each responsible for different aspects of the operation. More importantly, these command nodes were constantly communicating with each other and with frontline units. Human military doctrine is built on something we call mission-type orders, Jake explained. Instead of telling a unit exactly what to do, we tell them what we need accomplished and let them figure out how to do it. The hologram showed a human infantry unit that had been tasked with disrupting communications in a city. Instead of following a predetermined plan, they observed a local situation and decided to cut power to the communication center rather than attacking it directly. The result was the same, but the method was completely different from what a traditional commander might have ordered. Each unit is given objectives and guidelines, but they're expected to adapt their methods based on what they encounter. Jake continued. This means our overall strategy can change and evolve even while it's being executed. In another part of the display, a human naval unit that was supposed to attack orbital defenses had instead discovered that the planet's main shield generator was more vulnerable than expected. Without waiting for orders from higher command, they shifted their focus to the generator while transmitting their findings to other units that could exploit the opportunity. This is beginning to look like a living organism rather than a military operation, observed Sergeant Corval. How do you prevent units from working at cross purposes? Jake smiled. Training and communication. Every human soldier learns to think about the bigger picture, not just their own mission. And our communication networks are designed to share information instantly across all levels of command. The hologram showed the information networks connecting all human forces. Intelligence gathered by individual soldiers was immediately available to commanders, who could then adjust their strategies in real time. At the same time, strategic decisions were instantly communicated to tactical units, allowing them to adapt their actions to support the overall mission. But the most important element, Jake said, highlighting several parts of the display, is psychological. The hologram now showed the defending forces on Fortress Prime. As the human assault continued, their responses became increasingly desperate and uncoordinated. Units that had been prepared to face traditional attacks found themselves dealing with threats they had never trained for. Humans don't just attack military targets, Jake explained. We attack the enemy's decision-making process. We create so much uncertainty and chaos that they can't form effective responses. The display showed how human cyber warfare units were not just disrupting enemy communications, but feeding false information into their networks. Enemy commanders were receiving reports of attacks that weren't happening while real threats went unnoticed. Supply convoys were being rerouted to wrong locations. Reserve units were being deployed to defend targets that weren't actually under attack. This is psychological warfare on a massive scale, Professor Vextar observed, his mandibles clicking rapidly. You are not just fighting their military, you're fighting their minds. Exactly, Jay confirmed. The goal isn't just to defeat enemy forces. It's to make it impossible for enemy commanders to understand what's happening well enough to mount an effective defense. In the hologram, the defenders of Fortress Prime were now completely overwhelmed. Their carefully planned defensive strategies had been designed to counter specific types of attacks, but the humans were using attack methods that didn't fit any known pattern. Every time the defenders adapted to counter one human tactic, 3 new tactics appeared elsewhere. The beauty of this approach, Jay continued, is that it gets stronger the longer it continues. Traditional military operations tend to lose effectiveness over time as the enemy adapts. Human operations become more effective as we learn more about the enemy and exploit new opportunities. The simulation showed human forces that had been observing enemy responses for several hours and were now perfectly adapted to counter every defensive measure. What had started as apparent chaos had become a precisely orchestrated campaign that seemed to anticipate every enemy move. Total operation time, Jake announced, checking the mission clock in a hologram. 72 hours from initial deployment to complete victory. The amphitheater was completely silent. Every student was staring at the holographic display, which showed Fortress Prime under complete human control. The planet's defenses had been neutralized, its military forces defeated, and its command structure dismantled in less than 3 days. Captain Lisa Wong, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the amphitheater, finally spoke up. She was the only other human in the class, and Jake had almost forgotten she was there. "Jake, you should probably mention that this isn't even our best work," she said with a slight smile. "This is just standard human tactical doctrine. What you've shown them is what we teach to lieutenant colonels, not what our generals can do." The alien students turned to stare at Lisa, then back at Jake, then at the holographic display that had just revolutionized their understanding of warfare. Professor Vextar's 6 arms were trembling slightly as he approached the hologram controls. This changes everything we thought we knew about military science," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Professor Vextar circled the holographic display, like a predator examining its prey, his 6 arms moving independently as he manipulated different controls. His black eyes darted between various elements of Jake's simulation, trying to find flaws in the human approach. "This cannot be accurate," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of military experience. "No force, regardless of training or technology, could coordinate such complex operations in real time. The communication requirements alone would be impossible." Jake remained calm beside the controls. "Professor, would you like me to show you the communication systems we use?" "By all means," Vextar replied, gestured with her arms while the other 2 worked to isolate parts of Jake's simulation. Jake manipulated the display to reveal the layers of human military communication. Instead of the hierarchical trees that most species used, human forces operated with what looked like a web of interconnected nodes. Every human soldier carries a personal communication device that connects to a mesh network, Jake explained. Information flows in all directions simultaneously. A private who spots an enemy patrol can instantly alert everyone who needs to know, from his squad leader to the general planning orbital strikes. The hologram showed information flowing through the network like water through a sponge. Critical intelligence moved from bottom to top in seconds, while strategic updates flowed from command to tactical units just as quickly. But more importantly, Jake continued, the network is designed to survive damage. If a command center is destroyed, the network automatically reroutes through other nodes. We've tested these systems against total communication failures, and they still function. Commander Thexol stepped closer to the display, his massive armored form casting shadows across the holographic projections. But what about the coordination? How do you prevent your forces from interfering with each other? That's the beautiful part, Jake said, zooming in on a section of the battle where multiple human units were operating in the same area. We don't prevent interference. We plan for it and use it as an advantage. The display showed human air support coordinating with ground forces in real time. But instead of following predetermined flight paths, the aircraft were constantly adjusting their routes based on ground troop movements. When ground forces encountered unexpected resistance, air support immediately shifted to provide assistance. When air attacks created new opportunities, ground forces moved to exploit them without waiting for orders. This level of coordination requires trust, Jake explained. Every human soldier trusts that their comrades will adapt to support their actions, and they adapt their own actions to support others. It's not about following orders. It's about understanding the mission and working together to accomplish it. Captain Zarlin's luminous skin was pulsing with rapid color changes, a sign of extreme agitation in ethereals. But surely there are limits to this adaptability. What happens when your forces encounter something completely unexpected? Jake smiled and worked the controls again. The simulation rewound to show a point where human forces had encountered an unexpected offensive measure, a new type of shield technology that their initial attacks couldn't penetrate. Watch what happens, Jake said. In the hologram, the human forces that encountered the new shield technology immediately began testing different approaches. Within minutes, they had identified the shield's weaknesses and developed new tactics to counter it. More importantly, this information was instantly shared across the entire human force, allowing other units to prepare for similar defenses before they encountered them. Humans don't just adapt to unexpected situations, Jake explained. We expect unexpected situations and prepare for them. Every soldier is trained to experiment, to try new approaches when standard methods fail. The display showed human engineers who had been tasked with destroying a bridge, but found it too heavily defended. Instead of forcing the attack, they studied the bridge's construction and realized they could achieve the same strategic goal by rerouting a nearby river. The bridge remained intact, but became useless as enemy forces could no longer cross the diverted waterway. This is what we call thinking outside the box, Jake continued. Most species train their soldiers to follow established procedures. We train our soldiers to abandon procedures that aren't working and create new ones on the spot. Sergeant Corval spoke up from his position near the edge of the amphitheater. This explains the tactical flexibility. But what about strategic planning? How do you maintain an overall strategy when every unit is constantly changing its approach? The strategy isn't fixed, Jake replied. It evolves based on results. Our initial goal might be to capture a particular city, but if we discovered during the operation that destroying a different target would be more effective, we change the strategy. He showed how human command structures worked during his simulation of the Fortress Prime Assault. Instead of rigid adherence to the original plan, human commanders were constantly evaluating whether their current strategy was still the best approach. When better options emerged, they adapted the overall mission to exploit new opportunities. This is why the operation takes 72 hours instead of months, Jake explained. We don't waste time on approaches that aren't working. We identify what works and focus all our efforts on those methods. Professor Vextar had stopped his restless movement and was staring intently at one particular section of the hologram. "Show me this again," he demanded, pointing to a sequence where human forces had apparently retreated from a strong position, only to attack more effectively from a different direction. Jake isolated the sequence and replayed it. This unit was ordered to take a fortified position, but their initial attack revealed that the position was stronger than intelligence suggested. Instead of continuing to attack and taking heavy casualties, they withdrew and found a different approach. The hologram showed how the human unit had studied the fortified position and realized that its strength came from its ability to channel attackers into a killing field. Instead of accepting that disadvantage, they found a way to approach from an angle where the fortification's design worked against the defenders. The key principle here is that humans don't consider retreat to be failure, Jake explained. We consider it to be reconnaissance. Every failed attack teaches us something about the enemy that we can use to succeed later. But this violates fundamental military principles. Vextar protested. How can you maintain morale when units are constantly retreating and changing their objectives? Because every human soldier understands that temporary setbacks lead to ultimate victory, Jake replied. We don't measure success by whether a particular attack succeeds. We measure success by whether we accomplish our overall mission. The hologram showed the final result of the Fortress Prime Assault. Every major defensive position had been neutralized, but many of them had been bypassed rather than directly attacked. Human forces had focused their efforts on targets that would lead to overall victory, rather than trying to defeat every enemy force they encountered. This is perhaps the most important difference between human warfare and traditional approaches, Jake said, looking around the amphitheater at the stunned faces of his classmates. Most species try to win every battle. Humans try to win the war, even if that means losing some battles along the way. He paused the simulation and stepped back from the controls. The result is that human military operations get results faster, with fewer casualties, and against stronger opposition than traditional methods. The amphitheater remained silent for several minutes as students and professor alike tried to process what they had witnessed. Finally, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. But what happens when your improvisation fails? He voice belonged to Commander Krollvan of the Hegemony, a species known for the methodical approach to everything. His crystalline exoskeleton caught the light from the holographic display as he stood up from his seat near the back of the amphitheater. What happens when your improvisation fails? He repeated, his synthetic voice carrying clearly through the room. What happens when adaptation is not enough? When creativity cannot solve the problem? What then? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Every eye in the amphitheater turned to Jake, waiting for his response. Professor Vextar's mandibles clicked softly, suggesting he was very interested in the answer. Jake looked calmly at Commander Krollven for a moment before responding. Then we improvised a new solution. The simple answer seemed to frustrate the hegemony officer. His exoskeleton's color shifted to a deeper blue, indicating agitation. But that is no answer at all. There must be limits to adaptation. There must be situations where your methods simply cannot work. Of course there are, Jake agreed. Human warfare isn't magic. We can't win every battle, and we don't win every war. But the question isn't whether our methods have limits. The question is what we do when we reach those limits. He moved back to the holographic controls and began setting up a new scenario. Let me show you what happened during the Centauri Rebellion, about 20 years ago. A new planetary system appeared in the hologram, with multiple worlds connected by space lanes. Jake quickly sketched in the positions of human and rebel forces, creating a scenario where human forces were clearly outnumbered and outgunned. Human colonial forces were facing a rebellion supported by 3 major alien powers. Jake explained as he worked. Our initial strategy failed completely. Our backup strategies failed. Our emergency contingency plans failed. We were losing badly. The hologram showed human forces in retreat across multiple worlds, their communication networks disrupted and their supply lines cut. It was a picture of military disaster on a massive scale. So what do we do? Jake asked, pausing his work to look around the room. We changed everything. He continued working the controls, and the holographic display began to shift. When adaptation within existing frameworks didn't work, we adapted the framework itself. We stopped trying to fight a conventional war and started fighting a completely different kind of war. The display now showed human forces abandoning traditional military structures entirely. Instead of organized units following military doctrine, they broke up into small groups that operated more like guerrilla fighters and regular soldiers. We realized that the enemy was prepared to fight the human military, but they weren't prepared to fight human citizens who happened to have military training. Jake continued. So we became something they had never encountered before. Captain Zara Lynn leaned forward in her seat, her luminous skin flickering with interest. You abandoned your own military doctrine? Temporarily, Jake confirmed. Human military doctrine includes a doctrine of abandoning doctrine when doctrine doesn't work. Several students made sounds of confusion or disbelief. The idea of a military doctrine that included abandoning military doctrine seemed contradictory to most of them. But how can you maintain any kind of organization if your soldiers can simply decide to ignore their training? Asked a student from the collective, a hive mind species that prize perfect coordination above all else. They don't ignore their training, Jake replied. They use their training to create new approaches that weren't part of their training. Every human soldier learns not just specific tactics and techniques, but the principles behind those tactics and techniques. He manipulated the hologram to show human soldiers in the Centauri system using their military engineering training to build improvised weapons from civilian materials. Other soldiers were using their communications training to create networks using commercial equipment. Still others were using their tactical training to organize civilian populations into effective resistance groups. The result was that we continued to fight effectively even after our formal military structure had been destroyed, Jake explained. The enemy thought they had defeated the human military, but they discovered they were now fighting something much harder to predict or counter. Professor Vextar had been following the demonstration closely, his 6 arms taking rapid notes. This suggests that human warfare is not actually about military techniques at all, but about a particular way of thinking. Exactly, Jake said, clearly pleased that the professor was beginning to understand. Human warfare is ultimately about problem-solving under pressure. The specific techniques we use are less important than our ability to find new techniques when the old ones stop working. Commander Thexol spoke up from his position near the front of the amphitheater. But surely there must be some core principles that remain constant, some foundation that does not change even when everything else does. Jake nodded. There are core principles, but they're not tactical or strategic. They're psychological. First, accept that the situation will change in ways you don't expect. Second, trust your people to find solutions, even when you can't see what those solutions might be. Third, never stop learning from what happens, even if what happens is failure. He paused a holographic display and looked around the room. These principles apply whether you're fighting with advanced starships or improvised weapons, whether you're commanding 1,000,000 soldiers or fighting alone, whether you're winning or losing. Sergeant Corval raised one of his heavy arms to get attention. You speak of learning from failure, but failure in warfare means death. How can dead soldiers learn anything? They can't, Jake admitted, but their failures can teach others. Human military culture doesn't try to hide failures or pretend they didn't happen. We study them, analyze them, and share what we learn with everyone. The hologram shifted to show human after-action reports from the Centauri campaign. Instead of focusing only on successes, the reports documented every failure, every mistake, and every lesson learned from those mistakes. Every human soldier studies the failures of previous campaigns as much as the successes, Jake explained. We learn what doesn't work, so we don't repeat the same mistakes. But more importantly, we learn to recognize when something isn't working, so we can change our approach before failure becomes catastrophic. A student from the Synthesis, a species that communicated through mathematical formulas, projected a question through his translator device. What is the mathematical probability that this approach will succeed against any given opponent? Jake smiled at the question. That's the wrong question. The right question is, what's the probability that we'll find some approach that works, even if our first several approaches fail? He worked the controls to show statistical data from human military campaigns. Instead of showing success rates for specific tactics or strategies, the data showed adaptation rates and learning curves. Human warfare doesn't depend on having the right answer from the beginning, Jake explained. It depends on finding the right answer faster than the enemy can counter it. Our success rate isn't based on initial planning. It's based on continuous adaptation. The data showed that human forces typically tried an average of 7 different approaches before finding one that worked effectively against a new enemy. But once they found an effective approach, they could adapt it faster than enemies could develop counters. This is why the timeline for Fortress Prime was 72 hours. Jake continued. Not because we knew exactly what would work, but because we knew we could figure out what would work and implement it faster than the defenders could respond. Commander Crow then stood up again, his exoskeleton now showing colors that indicated deep thought rather than agitation. You are describing warfare as a form of accelerated evolution. That's a very good way to put it, Jake agreed. Human warfare evolves in real time, with successful adaptation spreading instantly through our forces, while unsuccessful approaches are abandoned just as quickly. The amphitheater fell silent again as students processed this concept. The idea that warfare itself could evolve and adapt was revolutionary to species that had perfected their military techniques over thousands of years. Finally, Professor Vextar spoke, his voice thoughtful and somewhat disturbed. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, you have shown us something that challenges the foundations of military science as we understand it. But I must ask, if human warfare is so effective, why do humans not simply conquer the galaxy? Professor Vextar's question hung in the air like a sword over the amphitheater. The 6-armed Zenthari stood perfectly still, his black eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Jake met the professor's gaze calmly. Because we don't want to conquer the galaxy, Professor. Human military doctrine isn't designed for conquest. It's designed for survival and defense of our values. But with such capabilities, Vextar pressed, his mandibles clicking rapidly. Surely the temptation for expansion, for dominance, must be overwhelming. Every species in galactic history has used its military advantages to expand its territory and influence. Before Jake could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. May I answer that question, Professor? Everyone turned to see a figure standing in the amphitheater's entrance. The newcomer was clearly human, wearing the dark blue uniform of the Galactic Defense Council. His insignia indicated he was a major, and his bearing suggested significant combat experience. Major Alex Carter, Galactic Defense Council. The newcomer introduced himself as he walked down the steps toward the central display. I apologize for interrupting your class, Professor Vextar, but I've been monitoring this discussion from the observation deck, and I think your students deserve to hear the complete picture. Professor Vextar's 4 upper arms crossed offensively, while his lower arms gestured toward the newcomer. Major Carter, This is a closed academic exercise. I'm not certain it's appropriate for outside observers to participate. Under normal circumstances, I would agree, Carter replied, stopping beside Jake at the holographic controls. But Lieutenant Colonel Martinez has just demonstrated something that the Galactic Defense Council has been studying for the past 5 years. I think it's time we shared our findings with the academic community. Carter activated his own datapad and interfaced it with a holographic display. New information began appearing in the air above the central projector, showing statistical analyses and probability models that made the complex battle simulations look simple by comparison. For the past 5 years, Carter began, the Defense Council has been running classified war games, pitting human military doctrine against every major galactic power. The results have been disturbing. The hologram now showed the results of thousands of simulated conflicts. In scenario after scenario, human forces achieved victory against larger, better-equipped opponents. The victory margins weren't small, either. They were overwhelming. We've tested human tactics against Corvin siege methods, ethereal precision strikes, garrison defensive strategies, hegemony systematic approaches, and dozens of others. Carter continued. In every case, human adaptability proved superior to established doctrine. Commander Thexol's massive form seemed to shrink as he processed the implications. You're saying that humans could defeat any of our military forces? Not just defeat, Carter replied grimly. Completely overwhelmed. The average time for human victory in these simulations was under 1 week against any single opponent. Against multiple opponents working together, the timeline extends to perhaps a month. The amphitheater erupted in whispers and gasps. Several students stood up from their seats, their various alien features showing shock, fear, and disbelief in equal measure. Professor Vextar raised 4 arms for silence. Major, surely these simulations cannot account for all variables. Computer models are not the same as actual warfare. You're absolutely right, Professor, Carter agreed. So we moved to live exercises with volunteer forces from various species. The results were even more pronounced. New data appeared in the hologram, showing records of actual training exercises between human units and alien military forces. The human victory percentages were so high they looked like errors in the data. But here's what's really interesting, Carter continued, manipulating the display to highlight specific data points. It's not just that humans win these engagements. It's how they win. Every opponent started each exercise confident in their military traditions and proven methods. By the end, they were questioning the fundamental assumptions their species had made about warfare for thousands of years. Captain Zarlin's luminous skin had gone almost completely dark, a sign of deep distress in ethereals. You are telling us that our military knowledge is worthless. Not worthless, Jake interjected gently. Just incomplete. Every species here has perfected particular aspects of warfare. The problem is that perfection often means inflexibility. When you perfect a system, you lose the ability to change it. Carter nodded and added more information to the display. Human military doctrine incorporates elements from every species we've encountered. We study Corvin logistics, ethereal precision, garrison defensive techniques, hegemony systematic analysis, and dozens of other approaches. But we don't perfect any of them. We use them as tools in a larger toolkit. This is why humans don't conquer the galaxy, Jay continued, returning to Professor Vextar's original question. We could probably succeed militarily, but conquest would require us to abandon the very principles that make our military effective. Human warfare is based on adaptation and flexibility. Empire requires rigid control and predictable administration. The two are fundamentally incompatible. Major Carter worked the controls to show a different kind of analysis, one that examined the political and social implications of military doctrine. Our war games have shown that human military advantages would disappear within a few generations if we tried to use them for conquest. The mindset that makes human soldiers adaptable will be destroyed by the mindset needed to maintain an empire. Sergeant Corval spoke up from his position near the edge of the amphitheater. But if you do not seek conquest, why develop such devastating military capabilities? Because, Carter replied, the galaxy is not a peaceful place. There are threats out there that require adaptive responses. Traditional military methods work fine against traditional enemies, but they fail completely against unconventional threats. The holographic displays shifted to show classified intelligence reports about various galactic threats. Rogue AI systems that adapted to counter every military response. Parasitic species that turned captured military units against their former allies. Technological plagues that corrupted and subverted established military networks. Human military doctrine was developed to counter threats that don't follow rules, Jake explained. Pirates who attack with stolen civilian ships. Terrorists who use commercial networks to coordinate attacks. Invasion forces that disguise themselves as refugees or traders. Traditional military forces are designed to fight other traditional military forces. Carter added, they assume enemies will behave according to established patterns. But the most dangerous threats in the galaxy are the ones that don't behave according to any patterns at all. Professor Vextar had been studying the classified data with growing concern. Major Carter, some of these threats, they are not theoretical, are they? Carter's expression became grim. No, Professor, they're not. The Galactic Defense Council has been dealing with unconventional threats for decades. Most species never hear about them because we handle them quietly, using methods that traditional military forces couldn't counter. The hologram now showed operational reports from human military units dealing with various unconventional enemies. In each case, the threats had proven immune to traditional military responses, but had been neutralized by adaptive human tactics. This is why humans were invited to join the Galactic Defense Council despite being newcomers to galactic civilization. Carter continued, not because we're more advanced or more powerful, but because we can handle threats that no one else can counter. Commander Kroven's crystalline exoskeleton was cycling through colors rapidly, indicating intense mental activity. You are describing humans as the galaxy's immune system. That's not a bad analogy, Jake agreed. We adapt to counter new threats the same way biological immune systems adapt to counter new diseases. The faster and more dangerous the threat, the faster we adapt to meet it. Major Carter saved the most significant data for last. New information appeared in the hologram, showing current threat assessments and probability analyses that made everyone in the amphitheater fall silent. There are threats coming that will require every advantage we can develop, Carter said quietly. The peaceful galaxy you've all known for the past 1,000 years is about to change. Traditional military methods won't be enough to protect what we built. Professor Vextar's 6 arms were trembling as he processed the implications of everything he had learned. Major Carter, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, you have fundamentally changed my understanding of military science in the span of a single class period. I am not certain my students or I are prepared for such revelations. Carter and Jake exchanged glances, and Carter nodded slightly. Professor, there's one more thing you should know about human military doctrine. Major Carter's words carried a weight that made the entire amphitheater fall completely silent. Even the soft humming of the holographic projectors seemed louder in the sudden quiet. Professor Vextar's 6 arms had stopped their nervous movements, and every student was focused entirely on the 2 humans standing beside the display. What I've shown you today, Jake said, looking around the room at the alien faces staring back at him, represents the thinking of one human officer with standard training, working alone, with 15 minutes to plan an operation. He paused to let that sink in before continuing. This is what we teach to lieutenant colonels. It's intermediate-level tactical thinking. It's not advanced. It's not our best work. It's just normal. Captain Zarlin's luminous skin flickered weakly as she processed this information. You are saying that what we have witnessed is considered basic by human standards? Major Carter nodded grimly. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez is a competent officer, but he's not exceptional within human military ranks. There are thousands of human officers who could have given you similar demonstrations, and there are hundreds who could have done significantly better. The holographic display shifted to show organizational charts of human military structure. Instead of the simple hierarchies most species used, the human system was incredibly complex, with multiple parallel command structures and decision-making networks that seem to overlap and interconnect in bewildering ways. This is why the Galactic Defense Council has been concerned. Carter continued. We've been studying human military capabilities not because we fear human conquest, but because we're trying to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. He manipulated the display to show comparative analyses between human and alien military thinking. The differences were even more pronounced than Jake's demonstration had suggested. Every other species in the galaxy has developed military doctrine based on their particular strengths and cultural values, Carter explained. Corvins emphasize strength and persistence. Ethereals value precision and efficiency. Garrison species focus on defense and patience. These approaches work well for each species, but they're fundamentally limited by those same cultural values. Humans develop military doctrine based on a different principle entirely. Jake added, "We don't emphasize our strengths. We emphasize our ability to develop new strengths when our current ones aren't adequate." The display now showed historical data from Earth, documenting how human warfare had evolved over thousands of years. Unlike other species, which had perfected particular approaches and maintained them for millennia, human military methods had changed constantly. Human warfare has never been stable, Carter observed. Every generation of human soldiers fights differently than their parents did. Every war teaches us new methods that we apply to future conflicts. We don't perfect techniques. We perfect the ability to develop new techniques. Commander Thexol spoke up, his massive armored form seeming smaller than it had at the beginning of class. But how do you maintain any kind of military tradition if everything constantly changes? The tradition is change itself, Jake replied. Human military culture celebrates adaptation, innovation, and the willingness to abandon methods that no longer work. Our heroes aren't the generals who perfectly executed established strategies. They're the ones who created new strategies when the old ones failed. Professor Vextar had been studying the historical data with growing fascination and horror. This suggests that human military capabilities are still evolving, that what you have shown us today may not represent the current limits of human warfare. It doesn't, Carter confirmed. Human military doctrine continues to evolve in response to new challenges and new opportunities. What Lieutenant Colonel Martinez demonstrated is based on techniques that are already several years old. Current human military thinking has moved beyond these approaches. The amphitheater erupted in nervous whispers as students realized the implications. If Jake's demonstration represented outdated human military thinking, what were current human military capabilities like? This is why we decided to share this information with the academic community. Carter continued, raising his voice to quiet the whispers. The galaxy needs to understand what human military doctrine actually represents, not just for practical reasons, but for psychological ones. He worked the controls to show psychological profiles of various species after exposure to human military thinking. The results were disturbing. Traditional military confidence had been replaced by uncertainty and fear in many cases. When established military powers realize that their 1,000-year-old traditions can be countered by a single human officer working alone for 15 minutes, it creates a crisis of confidence, Carter explained. Some species have responded by trying to copy human methods. Others have withdrawn from military affairs entirely. A few have begun considering preemptive strikes against human worlds. The last statement caused several students to stand up in alarm. The idea that some species might attack humans out of fear was clearly a new and terrifying concept. This is why education is so important, Jake said, stepping forward to address the students directly. Fear comes from misunderstanding. When you understand that human military doctrine is defensive rather than offensive, that it's designed to protect rather than conquer, the fear becomes manageable. But more importantly, Carter added, understanding human military capabilities allows other species to work with us rather than against us. The threats facing the galaxy require adaptive responses. Traditional military methods won't be sufficient. He manipulated the display to show threat assessments and projections for the next century. The data painted a picture of increasing instability and unconventional dangers that would challenge every established military tradition. Human military doctrine isn't just about humans, Carter continued. It's about survival in a galaxy where the rules of warfare are changing faster than traditional military institutions can adapt. We're offering to teach these methods to anyone willing to learn them. Sergeant Corval raised one of his heavy arms. You would share your military advantages with potential enemies? Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. Jake replied, when other species understand adaptive warfare, they become more effective allies and less dangerous as potential enemies. Everyone benefits from having more adaptive military capabilities available when unconventional threats emerge. Professor Vextar had been silent for several minutes, processing everything he had learned. Finally, he spoke, his voice thoughtful and somewhat shaken. Gentlemen, you have presented me with information that will require me to completely restructure my understanding of military science. More than that, you have challenged assumptions that my species has held for thousands of years. He paused, looking around the amphitheater to students, who were equally stunned by what they had witnessed. But I believe that is exactly what education should do, he continued. It should challenge assumptions, expand understanding, and prepare minds for realities they have not yet encountered. Vextar moved to the center of the room, his 6 arms gesturing to encompass both the human officers and his alien students. This class will be restructured, he announced. We will study not just traditional military doctrine, but adaptive military thinking. We will learn not just how to execute established strategies, but how to create new strategies when established ones fail. The students began talking excitedly among themselves, some expressing enthusiasm for this new approach, while others seemed overwhelmed by the implications. Professor, Commander Kroven said, his crystalline exoskeleton showing colors of deep concern, are you certain that is wise? Some knowledge is dangerous to possess. Vextar looked at the hegemony officer for a long moment before responding. Commander, the galaxy is changing whether we acknowledge it or not. We can either prepare for that change or be overwhelmed by it. I choose to prepare. He turned back to Jake and Carter. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, Major Carter, would you be willing to continue as guest instructors? I believe my students and I have much to learn from human military doctrine. Jake and Carter exchanged glances and nodded. We would be honored, Professor, Carter replied. As the class began to disperse, students clustered around the 2 human officers with questions and requests for clarification. The fear that had initially dominated the room was being replaced by curiosity and excitement about new possibilities. Professor Vextar remained beside the holographic display, staring at the complex patterns Jake had created. After several minutes, he spoke quietly to himself, unaware that Jake was still close enough to hear. In 3 centuries of teaching warfare, I thought I understood the limits of military possibility. Vextar murmured. Today I learned that those limits exist only in minds that accept limitations. Jake smiled and approached the professor. Vextar, if I may ask, what was the most important thing you learned today? The Zenthri considered the question carefully before responding. That the question I asked at the beginning of class was wrong. I asked you to explain human combat doctrine. But human combat doctrine cannot be explained. It can only be experienced and understood through practice. And now, Jake asked. Professor Vextar's mandibles clicked in what Jake had learned was the Zenthri equivalent of a smile. Now I understand why humans were really invited to join the galactic community. Not because of your technology or your resources, but because you think about problems in ways no one else does. He paused, looking at the data still displayed in the hologram. The galaxy is about to face challenges that traditional thinking cannot solve. We need minds that can adapt, innovate, and create solutions that have never existed before. Jake nodded. Professor, you asked about human combat doctrine. What I showed you today wasn't our combat doctrine. It was just one human with basic training, solving one problem. He gestured to the complex holographic display that had revolutionized the class's understanding of warfare. Imagine what we can do when we're actually trying